topic for today is one of my favorites, perfectionism. Is there such a thing as perfectionism? I'm sure everyone probably maybe knows somebody who's a perfectionist. Maybe you've experienced it at work, or maybe you've been a perfectionist. I was a perfectionist many, many years ago, and I drove myself and everyone else crazy, and that is not a lie. That's not an exaggeration either. Let me share with you some of the symptoms of perfectionism. Time is wasted on unimportant details, because perfectionists have to get it just right. A perfectionist will redo work already redone, even though they are the only ones who will see it. They find it difficult to make decisions, because they're always weighing things, you know. They have difficulty establishing priorities. They go on correcting, changing, rearranging, and improving, endlessly chasing perfection like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They insist on being right. They delight in pointing out others' mistakes. In my mind, there is no such thing as perfectionism. It's a myth, because there are so many variables in life. How could you possibly be perfect? You can't control everything. And I did try to control everything, but thank God, by the grace of God, I get over it. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, the 48th verse, there is a phrase that says, and Jesus says this, "Therefore you are to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." And so I think people are relentlessly pursuing this perfection, especially people who have paid attention to this verse. You know, we're after the perfect 10, you know, we look at perfection, beauty, you know, the models, well, they're perfect. There's the perfect 10. There's the, if I only had the perfect job, if I was just in the perfect relationship, it would be wonderful. And actually, this whole idea of perfectionism is a cause of a lot of pain and suffering in the world. Because the bottom line is, how can we be perfect? That's what people think. When Jesus introduced this topic and said this phrase, people thought, how in the world can I possibly be perfect? And so they had to take a look at themselves. And what does perfect mean? I actually looked this up in the dictionary. Lacking nothing essential to the whole, complete of its nature or kind. Now, does that mean we have to look perfect, or we have to behave perfectly? Our spiritual nature is complete. Not only is our spiritual nature complete, but we're not really different from each other on a spiritual level. And I've already said this, if we kind of unzipped, you ever see the movie Cocoon? They kind of unzipped your outer shell, this body, and took a look inside. We're all like light beams. We're all just little balls of energy, and we're all not different. The only difference is how we express our spirituality. So God really does not have a body, and God doesn't have a job. So it doesn't matter how we look or what we do. That's not the perfection we're talking about. To respond perfectly in all situations, that's the perfection I'm talking about. It's how we respond to situations. And in 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, the 12th chapter, the 9th verse, there's a phrase that says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness." That tells me that having a weakness is okay. That's not what it's about. So what seems to be an imperfection is actually a blessing. And if we look at it as a blessing, our whole life changes. So I want to tell you a little story sort of about a little bit of a sort of an imperfection, not exactly, but how many people have heard of Itzhak Perlman, the great violinist? Oh, an awesome violinist. In 1983, he was going to perform in the Avery Fisher Hall in the Lincoln Center in New York City. And if anybody knows anything about Itzhak Perlman, he has, as a child, he had polio. And so he has 2 of the braces on his legs, and he has 2 of the crutches, and he just kind of gets himself on stage painfully and slowly. And usually once he gets himself on stage, he sits down, he takes off his braces, he puts one foot under the chair, one leg under the chair, he puts the other leg forward, he picks up his violin and then nods to the conductor, and he starts to play. And most people that know or have been to any of his concerts know, and they're very respectful of the process of him getting on stage and getting into his chair. They're very reverent and they're very respectful, and there's a hushed quiet in the auditorium as he moves to do this. So he nods to the conductor, he starts to play. They play a couple bars and twang, like a gunshot through the hall. One of his strings on the violin breaks. And so for a second he stops playing. And the audience is in this really hushed silence. Everybody's thinking, oh boy, he just broke a violin string. And they expected him to put the braces back on, painfully and slowly go out to either get another violin or to get a string and restring his violin. But that's not what happened. He just nodded to the conductor again and he started playing. He played more beautiful than anyone had ever heard him with those 3 strings. And the audience was amazed. And he's playing, and it was almost as if as he was playing, he was retuning his violin. It was so beautiful, and the audience was in awe. And of course, when he was done, they all stood up and clapped. You know, he had played the most beautiful piece of music they have ever heard in their entire life, and that they had ever heard him play. And so he hushed the crowd, and he said to them, sometimes it's the artist's task to do the best we can with what we have left. And so you know that you can't play a violin with 3 strings, and I know you can't play a violin with 3 strings, but he was not willing to accept that. He took that violin, even with 3 strings, and turned it into a perfect instrument. So just like us, it's our job too, to just make the best music we can with whatever we have. It doesn't matter what we have. This is from Dr. John Lieberman, and he says, and getting in touch with God's perfection is all about awareness. I had talked before about conditioning ourselves for a spiritual experience. You look at those athletes in the Olympics. They practice for years. And I used to be an athlete. I played basketball, lacrosse, and softball in high school and college. You have to be in condition. And you want to know something? I never was injured. Never injured in high school, never injured in college. I'm an adult now. I go and I try and play basketball. Not in condition, of course, because I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, running. I hurt my knee. Well, that's why I have 2 knee replacements. And then a couple years later, I'm playing volleyball. Didn't condition myself, just went in there thinking I'm 16, hurt my other knee. And it's the same thing. Yeah, it hurt, trust me. I've been on crutches more times than you can imagine. But 2 knee replacements now, so I'm going to replace my whole body, one part at a time. So perfection is all about awareness, being in touch with this God's perfection. And so Dr. Jacob Lieberman says, opening our awareness is an ongoing process. Conditioning ourselves for a spiritual experience is an ongoing process. If we're not conditioned and ready, we're going to miss it. Or we're going to fail miserably. Every time we unfold one aspect of our lives, we begin to see possibilities for further expansion. An opening that may feel like the ultimate breakthrough at one point may later be seen as simply the prelude to the next miracle, and then the next, and on and on. Our potential for growth never reaches an end. Even death may simply be a transition to a new level of development. No matter how far we evolve, as long as we are alive, we will continue to experience expansion and contraction. Our goal is not some perfect state of permanent openness, but the ability to flow through life's ins and outs as effortlessly as we can, learning from each experience we meet. So, where is God's perfection? Well, darn, I have another story. Where is God's perfection? I'm going to share you another story about God's perfection. There is a school in New York City called, I think you pronounce it, Chush. It's a school for Jewish children with learning disabilities. It's a special school for Jewish children with learning disabilities. And sometimes the kids stay there for their entire educational career, and sometimes they make enough progress that they can go to a more conventional school. They can kind of graduate out of the special school. And one of the fathers, every year they have an annual fundraiser, and one of the fathers was, after he had said, oh, you know, this is really great, thank you for the great fundraising, he stood up in front of the group and he said, where is God's perfection in my son Shea? He doesn't understand like other kids understand. He has problems with math and reading. Where is God's perfection? And he told a story about his son. He said, one day we were walking past a group of kids that Shea knew, and they were playing baseball. And Shea said to his dad, Dad, do you think they'll let me play? And of course the father's heart sank, because here's this child, he says he has no athletic ability, he's not even coordinated. But then the father also thought, but if they would let him play, he'd feel this wonderful feeling of belonging and connectedness with them. So the father approached one of the boys in the outfield and said, you know, do you think Shea could play? And the boy in the outfield didn't know how to answer. He's like looking around for someone to kind of help him, another teammate. And he said, well, I guess so. It's the top of the 8th inning. We're losing by 6 points. You know, that next inning is the 9th inning. We'll put Shea up to bat. Not a problem. And so they gave him a glove and they put him out there to play short field, which is right sort of behind second base, if you've ever played softball short field. And so their team gets up to bat at the bottom of the 8th inning. They score a couple points. It's now the bottom of the 9th inning. His team is up to bat again. It's tied. They've managed to tie the score. Bases are loaded. It's Shea's turn to bat. And his dad thinks, I just can't believe that they are going to let him bat. And letting him bat could potentially sacrifice the game. He can't bat. He can't catch. He can't bat. But the team lets him bat. And so the pitcher from the other team kind of takes a couple steps forward, knowing what he's like, and he kind of lobs the ball to him. And Shea does this clumsy, awkward swing and doesn't even come close to the ball. And so one of Shea's teammates comes over and puts his arms around him and helps him hold the bat, and then the pitcher takes a couple more steps forward and lobs the ball in softly. And with the teammate's help, Shea hits this short little soft grounder to the pitcher. So the pitcher, of course everybody's saying, run Shea, run to first base. And Shea's like, first base? And his eyes are wide. He's never run to first base before, and he's running to first base as awkwardly as he can. And the pitcher picks up the ball and throws it way over the first baseman's head, way over his head. And then, of course, everybody's yelling, Shea, run to second, run to second. And the first baseman knew what the pitcher had in mind. So the first baseman throws the ball way over the third baseman's head. And now the entire team is running behind him. Shea, run to third, run home. And of course, Shea runs home and saves the game. And so all 18 players pick him up on their shoulders and congratulate him. He won the game. And the father said, and it was at that moment that those teams reached the level of God's perfection. That is what God's perfection is about. Imagine what it would have been like to be there. So let's talk about how we're going to get in touch with God's perfection. When we go to God for spiritual direction or for some guidance, we're tapping into God's perfection. When we give up the misguided ways of the lower self, and the lower self is the ego, and the letters E-G-O mean easing God out. When we're into ego, we've pushed God out. There's also a saying that says, if we no longer feel close to God, who moved? So when we're giving up and working through and healing anger, resentment, some of the things from the past, we are allowing God's perfection to come through us. When we give up anger and allow love to fill our being, and we're able to express that love to other people, that's reaching the level of God's perfection. When we give up worry and doubt and fear and allow the peace of God to take control of our minds and our hearts and our souls and our bodies, we have reached the level of God's perfection. When God heals diseases or gives us that little nudge about where to go, what doctor to go to, what service to go to, we are reaching into God's perfection. When we pray for divine order, or when we affirm divine order, knowing that whatever the outer appearance, God is in every experience, we have tapped in to God's perfection. Jesus knew what he was saying. And the entire scriptures, especially in the New Testament, is full of tips and techniques on how to live a successful life when you interpret the Bible metaphysically. There's tips in there, there's techniques in there. If your body tends to show any imperfection, there's nothing like looking in the mirror thinking, oh my God, look at my hair today. Or, you're driving here, you're drinking a Coke, this is me. You're driving here, you're drinking a Coke, you're eating an Egg McMuffin, big blob of cheese falls right here. You just don't know how many times I've done that. And it's like, oh my God, I know they're going to see this big blob of cheese. There's the string thing. Big blob of cheese right here. It's the only thing they're ever going to see. But we want to overlook that. We're going to overlook that. We're going to look in the mirror and we're going to say, you are beautiful. You are a perfect child of God who does not inherit sickness. So, if we want to condition ourselves for a spiritual experience, if we want to tap in to this God's perfection so that we can express God's perfection, and this is really interesting because my brother called me yesterday. My brother lives in Harrisburg and he's very Catholic. And, every time he starts having these spiritual discussions or religious discussions, I want to back away. I grew up Catholic. And I went to Catholic school for 12 years. But he was saying, well, what are you going to talk about tomorrow? And it's like, oh, God. Do I want to tell him? Because then he has an interesting way of interpreting things. And I said, I'm going to talk about God's perfection. And he goes, well, what do you think it is? And I tell him a little bit, and then he says, oh, yeah, I think so too. He goes, I think God's perfection is doing the best we can. And is that not right? Is that not right, giving ourselves 100% of the time to whatever experience we're having? That is God's perfection. When we do the best we can, we are expressing God's perfection. So here are some tips. I have 10 tips on what you can do to condition yourself for that spiritual experience and express more of God's perfection in your life. Stop all criticism. Criticism never changes a thing. Refuse to criticize yourself. Accept yourself exactly as you are. Everybody changes. When you criticize yourself, you're just drawing on that negative energy. When you approve of yourself, you're drawing on positive energy. Don't scare yourself. Stop terrorizing yourself with your thoughts. Seriously, stop terrorizing yourself with your thoughts, with your fears. Find a mental image that gives you pleasure. Maybe flowers, a puppy, a beautiful landscape, and focus on that so that your scary thoughts will dissipate. We can really almost scare ourselves to death with our thoughts, with our fears. Be gentle, kind, and patient with ourselves. Be kind to ourselves. Be patient with ourselves as we're learning new things. There aren't mistakes, there's just feedback. This works, this doesn't work. There's no mistakes, it's just feedback, that's all. This relationship isn't working, well, that's feedback for you. Maybe it's not the right relationship for you. Praise yourself. Criticism breaks the inner spirit. Praise builds it up. Praise yourself. Because the bottom line is, you're the one who you have to live with. If you're looking for praise outside, it may never happen, so you really want to be praising yourself. Support yourself. Find ways to support yourself. Reach out to friends and allow them to help you. It's being strong to ask for help. Asking for help is not a weakness. It's not saying that you can't do it. It's actually a sign of strength to be able to recognize when you need help and when you need support. Be loving to your negatives. If you've got negative thoughts in there, just kind of embrace them, give them a warm hug, take them with you for a drive out in the country. Really embrace your negatives. Love them to death. It's like love your fears to death. And they will die and dissipate due to lack of attention. If you're always thinking about your negatives, what we dwell on increases. Just give them a hug and move on. Take care of your body. Learn about nutrition, learn about exercise. Find some things that you can enjoy. Cherish and revere the temple you live in. That's my lesson. You know, being a little more conscious of nutrition. I eat like a teenager. I do. Mirror work. Look into your own eyes often. Have you ever done this? This is not easy to do. I'm telling you, try this. Look into the mirror in the morning, look at yourself, and just say, Donna, you are beautiful. See if you can do that. See how it feels. For some people, it's going to feel very, very awkward, but when you can get to the point where you can say, Donna, you are beautiful, and you can say, yes, then you know you've really made an internal change. Try the mirror work. Forgive people at least once a day. Forgive someone who you feel has done something to you. And for some people, they also have to forgive God because they like to blame God for things, as if God's controlling the universe. But God's not controlling the universe. But forgive yourself. That's another big one. Forgive yourself. We need self-forgiveness for making some, decisions that weren't right at the time. And we all do that. It's human. We've made some decisions, they don't fit, we got into a relationship that sucked. Forgive yourself. It's important. And then, of course, love yourself. Here and now. Don't wait until you lose weight. If I was just 50 pounds thinner, I know I'd love myself more. That may be a goal that's going to elude you or me. So it's important to love yourself as you are now. Because in God's eyes, if God had eyes, and God doesn't have eyes, but what God would see would be that you're perfect just the way you are. And God would be thinking, I am so pleased with how you are. It is so exciting to see you growing and changing. That is God. That's how God would be. Hey, did you ever see the movie Chariots of Fire? Anybody see the movie Chariots of Fire? It was a while ago. About the Olympic runners, and the one runner he wanted to be a missionary, and this is Scotland, I think, and they're walking out among the heather and gentle rolling hills in Scotland, and he's talking to his sister, and she's saying, I thought you were going to be a missionary. What are you doing? No, these aren't her exact words, but she's like saying, what are you doing? Running and practicing and getting in shape for the Olympics. You're supposed to be a missionary. And he says, yes, I know I'm supposed to be a missionary. But God also made me fast. Too. And when I run, I feel God's pleasure. So when we're expressing God's perfection, we feel God's pleasure in us. I invite you to prepare for meditation. John, could you get those lights for us, please? I invite you to just gently close your eyes and become comfortable in your chair. And I invite you to do a mental scan of your body. And yes, please do with these nice comfortable chairs. It's like, I am so cozy, these chairs are so nice, I'm nice and warm. But I invite you to do a mental scan. And if you notice any tension anywhere, maybe your shoulders or your back, or if you're having some pain, then I invite you to just give your body permission to relax and release that pain or that tension. And I want to invite you to take a look at your mind and imagine yourself taking a big broom and just sweeping out any negativity, sweeping out any thoughts of what are we going to do after the service, what are we going to do tomorrow, don't like the way that coworker treats me. It's that time of year, the kids are in pain, they can't get outside. Just sweep those all away, out the door, until all those negative thoughts and feelings dissipate into the horizon. And now that your mind is relaxed and open and your body and heart are open, I invite you to breathe in this affirmation. I am open and accepting of my inner teacher, because that's where God resides, in you. I am open and receptive to my inner teacher. First thing I want to invite you to bring to mind is if you have any of the perfectionism tendencies, I want to invite you to release them gently. Because the truth is that you are perfectly imperfect. And it doesn't matter what you do, or what you say, or how you feel, you are loved just the way you are. And I invite you to know that the way to tap in to God's perfection, which is also inside of you, the way to express God's perfection is to know and have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt that God's grace, the Spirit of the Divine, the Spirit of the Goddess, is in every experience, and you are safe and secure and surrounded by love. Know that when we affirm divine order, when we say no matter what the outer appearance, that all is in divine order, we are inviting God's perfection into that experience. When we release anger and ask and be willing to open our hearts and ask and give ourselves permission to let that love flow into us and out of us and then back into us again in that never-ending circle, we are experiencing and expressing God's perfection. And I invite you to practice the art of forgiveness. Because the bottom line is, when we don't forgive someone, they don't really care. They're moving on, living their lives. And there's a saying that goes, I realized that unforgiveness was a prison, and the prisoner was me. So forgiveness has to do with us and not anyone else. So I invite you to forgive those people that you feel may have wronged you way back even when you were a child. If you have felt sometime in your life that God has not come through for you, then you want to also forgive God. And I also want to invite you to forgive yourself. Maybe there were times when you said yes and you really meant no. Maybe there were times when you said no and you felt so guilty because you really wanted to say yes. Maybe there were times when you felt that you had to disappoint someone because you needed time alone. Forgive yourself. It's always good to take care of yourself. When we let go of resentments and we let go of fear, then we are inviting in God's perfection, because two things we know in physics cannot occupy the same space. If we're letting go of fear, then something has to fill that void. And so we want to invite love to fill that void. And I would like to invite everyone to breathe in this affirmation. This is my all-time favorite affirmation, and I use it many, many times. And the affirmation is, I am safe and secure and surrounded by love. I am safe and secure and surrounded by love. Because truth is, we are safe and secure and surrounded by love. So I invite you to know in your heart and in your entire being that you are more than capable of expressing God's perfection at any time you choose to. It's there within you, ready, willing, and able to express itself in your life. And so I invite you to begin to move around in your seat and come back to your place. Some people do travel during meditations.